you're given, almost like in elementary school, you have like laminated like green card, and if like you get your green card pulled, then like you have like detention or whatever. They kind of look like that, with the exception of like the DNRs were only triaged to a 3. Isn't that like still an ethical practice to triage people like in a disaster situation?
Triaging is ethical. But how we triage and what we use to justify the way we triage is where we blur lines.
So because of like the DNRs?
Right. I mean, that was something that had never been used as a criteria before. Does anybody totally agree with using DNR orders as or totally disagree? Do you think that should have been part of the equation or not? Amanda?
I feel like DNR order doesn't necessarily mean you want to die. It could just mean that you don't want to, like, be, be arrived or, like, have to be alive by machines.
Okay.
Because, like, a lot of people don't want that, and some people, their bodies aren't strong enough to handle being revived and having cracked ribs and all that kind of stuff. So just because you have a DNR doesn't mean you want to die. So like I don't think that should be taken into consideration.
Okay, now in Ohio, remember we talked about how we have 2 different kinds of DNR orders? So if one of them is comfort care only, I don't want to be treated, just make me comfortable. Does this go against that?
Is that falling under the same criteria?
What criteria?
Just the whole DNR?
Well, there's 2 different kinds. There's one that if I am found unresponsive, leave me that way.
It doesn't fall under that.
But if I get cancer, I want treated. Or if I get a urinary tract infection, I want treated. I just don't want revived if I'm arrested. The other one is I'm refusing all treatment for everything, just keep me comfortable until I'm dead. And that can be enacted at any time. I mean, one of you can go sign one of those tomorrow. I wouldn't understand it, but you could. So if that's the type of DNR order, and is what they did necessarily a bad thing? If all you got to do is make me comfortable. Caprice?
I don't know, I'm in the mood, but I feel like well, technically they are comfortable, but I don't know.
Like comfortably dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Technically, like if
I mean,
that's
it's
what
not
they
just
want.
comfortable,
Yeah.
but yet they're not facing the misery or the heroic efforts of the staff of what's going on around them, right?
Well, they want to be comfortable, not dead. It's a little bit different. So, I feel like if they needed it, if they needed that to be more comfortable, then you are following their care plan. But if you are just doing it to make your workload easier, you're not.
But they
Okay.
weren't comfortable, like in this situation, in the hospital.
Did you ask?
Like,
Okay, they didn't ask.
like the patients weren't comfortable, like they were starving, like they weren't getting maintenance IVs, like they weren't getting maintenance oxygen as needed. I don't think they were comfortable, per se.
So you would be like, oh yeah, let's do something to make you more comfortable and like
But is that your judgment?
I don't think it's right, but I don't think it was comfortable.
So would you give them medicine to make them more comfortable, as they said? Because that was their justification. It was
I feel like
making
that'd be a
them relax.
conversation with the patient.
Yeah. I think
Like
that's
you have to be
interesting.
upfront and honest about it. You have to say like why we don't give them a lethal injection because that's just a little. I'm gonna kill you right now, dude. But
Yeah.
like give them like talk to them and give them like a certain amount of like medication to like.
Morphine.
Yeah.
He
it's like-
increased them more.
Just like calm them down. Like, but you have to make sure that they agree with what you're doing and give them all the information.
And that brings
That's
up a
like-
point,
patients
because in
are
a
treated
disaster, what do you have time to ask, like, their family, like, no one was picking up their phone, like, hey, so, it's, they have a DNR, we're gonna put them last, like, what did they have time to actually get formal consent from people who were unconscious or anything like that?
You know?
It was a mess, and it was a great learning experience for this whole country. Yeah. All right, nice job, guys. Group 2.
No, bring it up. I just have my note.
Oh.
I wrote a lot. Here, butter. I got it here.
Okay, so this is our Katrina project, and we did it on the standards of practice. So before we start the review, what happened in the article. So, of course, Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans, but the article base touched in the Memorial Medical Center. It was about 2,000 people that were in the hospital, 200 of them were patients. And Anna Powell was one of the main surgeons who worked in the hospital. They were categorized from 1 to 3, 1 being the person who needed to be out, 3 was basically the person who probably would not get out. Powell was told to administer a combination of morphine and benzodiazepine. She claimed that she did this to relieve the patients from pain and sedate those who were anxious. In July 2006, she was arrested on 4 counts of principal second-degree murder. They did not indict her because they didn't feel like she had a specific intent to kill the people in the hospital. These are the standards of practice. They were developed by the American Nurses Society to provide guidelines for nursing performance, and they provide adequate and high quality patient care. So the first one is assessment, and you just collect data and information relative to the healthcare consumer's health or the situation.
Second one is diagnosis, and so it's defined as analyzing the assessment data to determine actual or potential diagnoses, problems, and issues. So you just take what you found in the assessment, and for us, obviously, it'd be like the nursing diagnosis. And so ours would just be like looking at what's going on, being like, all right, this is something we can diagnose instead of making the actual medical diagnosis. So it's slightly different between nurses and doctors.
The third one is outcomes identification, which is identifying expected outcomes for a healthcare plan for a patient. So basically your goals and outcomes for the patient, what you want them to accomplish while they're in your care.
Planning is to develop a plan to achieve those measurable outcomes. So after you develop what you want your patients to do, now you got to figure out where for them to do it.
Implementation is implementing the care plan to the patient. So once you figure out what the patient needs, you implement the patient-centered care plan.
Evaluation determine the effectiveness of the care plan, and so not always will the care plan be completed, I guess, or successful, and so sometimes you have to alter it, or you can just go back through and do similar steps again, and you just continue evaluating every time you come to see the patient.
Okay, so were all of the standards maintained, and if they weren't, how were they not? So the first one was assessment, and I felt that assessment was maintained because basically nurses had to assess each patient to triage them and to basically give them a number 1, 2, or 3. So we had to look at them and basically say, how healthy are you, how unhealthy are you, where should you be going? So that's part of assessment. Also, they had to assess people that were arriving to the hospital to basically figure out if the hospital was prepared enough to take care of these people, which they ended up just turning away most people that were coming. Okay, the next one is diagnosis, and I felt that this one was not maintained because a lot of the patients that received the morphine injection didn't have any documentation or a diagnosis that stated that they needed the morphine. And nurses were also really focused on evacuating patients or keeping them alive instead of figuring out a nursing diagnosis for their patient. Okay, next one is outcomes identification. I also said this one was not maintained because every single goal or outcome for their patients was focused around evacuating or injecting them with morphine. There were no unique centered goals on each patient focused on getting them better. It was all focused on getting them out. So planning was also not maintained because part of standard of planning is advocating for responsible and appropriate use of interventions to reduce unwanted treatment and patient suffering. So while I guess you could argue they were reducing patient suffering, obviously they didn't ask the patients, so plenty of these treatments could have been unwanted. They weren't really advocating for their patients. They did plan to administer the morphine, but because they didn't really need it, that also violates planning. Also, some patients believed that they were going to be evacuated, and they were given an injection to make them feel better, only to never wake up. And then documentation is also a big part of that, and it was not maintained because a few patients that died were actually already being treated with morphine, which goes back to the diagnosis. Implementation was not maintained. Even though they did implement care, they were not implementing patient-centered care. They kept people clean, and they gave them water, but all medical interventions that they were doing prior were stopped, except for like the injections and stuff. The only real implementation, obviously, was the injections. And then evaluation was maintained, because that's pretty hard not to maintain. The doctors and nurses basically needed to confirm that their patient either evacuated or died from the injection. It's really hard to not evaluate what's going on around you. And then all of the standards were not maintained to the level that they should have been in a non-emergency situation, but that was obviously because the hospital was in survival mode and not in treating mode.
Okay, so what were the consequences of maintaining standards? And so for assessment, we determined that it was maintained. And so one of the things they did with it was they determined who was most at risk with the 1, 2, and 3, and who needed to be moved first, like who needed that medical attention. And obviously 1 were the healthiest, and then 3 were the worst cases and the DNRs. And so what they determined as a result of that was that 1s were going to be evacuated first, and that 3s most likely wouldn't be. And so that was through the assessment of saying, all right, this person's healthy enough to go, and so obviously the consequence of that was this person got to go and this person had to stay, and well, someone would euthanized. So they had limited supplies, and so also with that assessment, with the 1, 2, 3, they had to determine who would actually get them or not. And so there was that one person, Vera LeBlanc, who was 83, and she needed an IV, and I believe it was her daughter who was there and was trying to speak up for her, but they just said with her condition they didn't have enough of the medical supplies, which obviously was all done through assessment because they could see she was dehydrated, but then they also had to look at the supplies they had available, and as a result of that they decided not to give her it. And again, that was the consequence with her being that dehydrated and her medical status decreasing even more. All this goes back to the 1, 2, 3. Like with the evacuation was safe for the patient, and again, this level 3, they're deemed unable to do it, and they also had to look at the environment around them because it mentioned a lot how it was becoming more dangerous, and there were like rumors of nurses getting attacked, and so they just had to decide who was easier to move, who could be moved quicker, so that they themselves could get out of that environment.
And then evaluation, we also determined that it was maintained. And so one of the things was it determined the lethal dose was effective and he was left in the building. And one of the things that they didn't do right with that was they did the documentation, they completed it, which is part of that, but some of it was faked. Like there was that one instance, I don't remember which patient it was for, but they began the death certificate and they filled it out except for the time of death because they hadn't given the injection yet, and they just gave that to the physician, I believe, to fill out later. And so, well, I guess some consequences with that are, well, obviously they document it, and so when they were being investigated later, they could look and see, oh, this person had this administered at this time, and this person had this, even though that's not in their usual chart, and they could just find out how many people that they did euthanize. So some of it they had to do at the with the autopsy.
So my part is, what were the consequences not maintaining, or what were the consequences of not maintaining the standards? So I believe that, first of all, diagnosis was not maintained. You giving these people a lethal dose of morphine injection, and many of these patients, as indicated in the reading, that they are not near critical condition, and they were given it. So diagnosis was not maintained. Then outcome identification and planning was not maintained. So what the physician and the nurses did, they were basically putting expected outcome for these patients at death, and they were trying to achieve this outcome. But as we all know, that is not a plausible outcome for the patient. And then there were insufficient amount of time and effort in planning. So this senior physician, Dr. Ian Cook, he just basically gave the order to euthanize the patient, and subsequently causing the death of the patient over there. And some of the patients were still stable and lucid, such as that patient, Rose. She was given the lethal dose of injection when she was still well aware of her situation. And lastly, implementation was not maintained. As my team member have mentioned, the hospital was in survival mode, but not in treating mode. So only water, diaper, and minimum level of ventilations were provided, and medical interventions were severely limited.
Okay, so given this situation, what would need to be different in order to maintain standards? So what do you guys feel like which standards would have to be altered in order for it to be maintained correctly?
The one about diagnosis, actually treat what they were diagnosed for.
Okay, so I kind of went back and forth with the situation. So I said, like, given the situation and the doctors and everybody was involved, I feel like they did what they could with the time and the circumstances given. I feel like they had enough time to do every standard of practice to every patient. The standards assessment, diagnosis, planning are patient-centered, and due to the amount of people in the hospital, they did not have enough time to develop individualized care plans. I feel like each step affects the outcome of the next step, but implementing caused the most problems. And in the stage of implementation, it involves implementing a care plan that is safe, effective, and patient-centered. And during that stage, patients were not centered, nor were they involved. And the plan was supposedly to make the patients feel less anxious or take the pain away. And when the plan of administering sedative drugs took place, it did not include the patient's input. So like Emmett Everett, he was aware of his surroundings, he fed himself, and he basically asked them were they ready to rock and roll. So that means like he was fully aware and he thought that he was going to get out. And then there was a 61-year-old man, and he said he had a great sense of humor and he did not complain of pain. So I feel like the plan didn't really, I feel like they were selfish when they did the plan because it didn't affect everyone, because there was some people there who weren't anxious or who weren't in pain. And I feel like in the pile, she walked around the fact that the sedative drugs would kill them. So like it wasn't communicated to the patients or it wasn't agreed, so they didn't even have their informed consent about it. And I put the these two quotes, basically them saying, this is gonna make your dizziness go away, or I'm gonna give you something to make you feel better. So instead of like saying like the drugs will kill them, they basically just said it to get it over with, or just like not really face the truth.
Okay, for this one, we're gonna ask you guys which ones do you disagree with how we decided on them?
Does anyone disagree? Because when I was doing this, I was struggling to like really figure out which ones were and were not maintained.
I keep going back to assessment because like, yeah, you're triaging them, but you're not completely assessing them.
Yeah.
Like you're just triaging like, are they a 1, 2, or 3? You're not seeing like, oh, have they gotten better? Have they gotten worse? Is their condition stable? Like, I don't really think that was completely maintained how it's supposed to be maintained in school practice.
I kind of struggle with all of those,
Yeah.
like you did.
Yeah.
Because the very last thing on that slide says they were in survival mode, not treating mode. So in order to have a plan of care, you're treating a patient, right?
Exactly.
So if you flip that and call it survival mode, did they assess the situation? Did they assess which patients were more critical and decide how they were gonna, the outcome identification was things like, okay, we need to get them out of here. Planning then was, how are we gonna do that? It became more of a, survival than treatment. So I think if you flip the if you focus on that priority instead of the patient was at the hospital for treatment, I think some of those then would change.
Yeah.
It depends on the what you're actually looking at, I think. So with limited staff and resources, they were focused just on basic needs, air, water, as cleanliness as, as much as they could be, that kind of thing, yeah.
Well, my discussion question is, who or what do you think is the ultimate cause of these standards not being maintained?
The hurricane.
Okay. What about the other causes? Besides that one, okay, that's natural causes.
No, but like, you know what I mean? Like they're in a disaster situation, so they're in, what is it, survival? Survival mode.
But what
instead of
ultimately
treating mode?
caused the survival modes to be activated?
They lost power
Yes, and why would they lost power?
because of the water.
And there's one very specific paragraph in the article that explains why they lost power.
Very specific.
Very specific
The
paragraph.
backup generator failed.
No, how does it fail?
We failed.
So they got short circuit.
So like, the hospital was hit by another hurricane years before, and they were evaluating their backup generating system, and they found out that their generator is too low.
Oh, did they never get fixed?
No, they didn't get it fixed because they determined that it was too expensive, and they only made a couple of less expensive improvements, but didn't change it as a whole.
So,
So I mean, what's the question
They put a
exactly?
Band-Aid on the situation.
Yeah,
Yeah, they put a
like,
Band-Aid on the situation
just
instead
put
of
a Band-Aid
fixing
on
it.
the gushing food.
Yeah.
Had they moved it a little bit higher,
What is your question exactly?
like who or what is the true cause of these standards not being maintained? Had the hospital have power,
Well,
these standards would definitely be maintained. What
we
do you
already
think?
started before like the backup generator went out.
What was that?
Yeah,
I think
but like
things
if
would
they
have been
still
better.
had the backup generator, they
Well,
would've
even the
had
backup
those
generator
before
couldn't
even
solve the
these
issue.
I know, but like,
Yeah, they
it
were
was
still-
already there before like the backup generator.
They were still giving care though,
They were
because
still
they had
running
the
out of
generator and they were
Yeah,
able
so
to do that
regardless,
stuff.
of, you can't just
But
say
if they
like,
have power, they could last a long longer.
I know, but you can't just say like that is like the main cause of like everything, because that's not.
Why not?
Dr. Coffey?
So generators are ran on fuel, right? So eventually that's gonna run out too, because there's
Right.
probably no way they're gonna get fuel. So yeah, I mean, it would have prolonged, it would have given them more time, but I think ultimately it would have failed as well. Don't you? I mean, usually they run on gas or gasoline.
That's
or-
true, but I think if they could last
They can last
a
a
few
long
days
time.
longer
Like a long time.
and wait for the National Guards or other
Absolutely.
people to come,
Mhm. Somebody to
maybe
wake up and
less-
do something,
A lot less
yeah.
people dying.
Yeah,
Especially those people who are on ventilators on the top floor.
Mhm.
Those
I
people
just
in
think
ninth care.
it would have just prolonged
Yeah.
it would have just prolonged what happened. I mean,
I feel
I
like
just
they
think
would've
like
had
it
a
would,
better chance to
regardless,
get
they would have
out.
still killed the
think it would've
patient.
made a difference.
It wouldn't
I mean,
have
just
made a
think about it. Just think about it. If the generator is still on, they could have used the elevator to transport people.
Oh, dun, dun,
difference.
dun.
Well, no, so that's the backup generator though.
necessarily.
That's the backup generator.
Yeah,
like,
that's true.
Well,
was
the
just
first
supporting,
generator,
like-
their main generator failed because it was too low.
well, it's not even going to power like the elevator.
It
It's
could.
Just, it's just,
How do
it's
you know
just
that?
like assist like.
The backup generator is one thing, but all that because of the main generator failed.
Well,
If they
regardless.
still have the main generator, they could turn on the
I get
elevator.
you. I'm just saying, regardless. It would even have made a
usually,
difference.
at least in
Many patients were
hospitals
killed
that
because
I'm,
they couldn't figure out a way to transport them.
in hospitals that I'm familiar with, anytime the power would go out, there would be like one elevator that would work.
Oh.
So the generator would power an elevator.
Yeah,
It might be the freight elevator or whatever, but the general public elevators would not
So pretty
function.
much you transfer like one patient in like 10 minutes. Like go up and then take them to wherever and then come back. It wouldn't have made a difference.
Well, I was
It would, it would.
If you had
Then
more than one person transferring people, like you had 2 people per patient, so you bring them up, take them where they're supposed to go.
Because
you
there are
have
a lot,
somebody
there are a lot
else
of
bring them up, take them where
patients.
they're
Still,
supposed
they
to go.
would,
Needed to be
the nurses would have still been
Mhm.
tired.
Oh, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
well, yeah.
well,
So-
but
So
using
it helped a
elevators
little bit.
is better than taking someone up and down the stairs. Wouldn't you agree?
So are you implying that you think that the whole euthanasia thing was just because they were tired?
It was lack of planning, for starters.
Uh-huh.
They didn't plan well. So all I'm just saying for his point is
Mhm.
like for the backage and what's the main cause of it. But like you know, like one thing will lead to another. So there was already there's already something going on before like the backage generator went on. So I mean, it would have just slowed the process, but it would have still happened at the end of the day.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with you because from what I remember, and I haven't read the article for a couple of months, but from what I remember, there were always promises of evacuation. This group is coming. This helicopter is coming. This boat is coming. Somebody's coming. So I think maybe the euthanasia may have been put off. If they had power, they may have been more willing to wait for whoever was coming. The other thing is, there was a mandatory evacuation. So they had to leave. They had to either abandon their patients or do what they did. It's a tough call.
Evacuation, why wasn't there like more help coming in? Like whether it was staffing help or like more rescue teams, if they were actually under a mandatory evacuation?
That would be a question for the government.
Where was
Mhm. Yeah, they just came out with that directive because they were worried about looting and crime and the water rising, and they said everybody needs to get out.
But then they're just abandoning the patients.
Mhm.
Okay, Ari, do you still have what you want to say?
Well,
Uh-oh.
say that it's because they panicked because when they were in survival mode, like Roy said, the generator failed, so they just started panicking. And even if the generator was on, they would have panicked the way they did. I feel like they would have made some of the same decisions, of course.
Amanda had her hand up first.
So,
Wow.
so, like even if, let's talk about, so the first generator's gone, they have the backup generator. Let's say that they move the backup generator and they have power from the backup generator. The problem is that's only gonna last so long, like she said. So would they start making decisions to cut certain people from that power?
What do you mean cut people off?
So in order to save power and prevent losing it, would you cut certain people who don't
Right.
necessarily need the power?
Because in order to conserve
Yes.
power from a generator, you want to use as little as possible. So then again, then you're rationing electricity based on
Yeah, like do you really need
based
lights?
on what?
You got flashlights, do you need overhead lights?
Good point.
I mean, it's still better than everyone else being off it and being like, all right,
Yeah.
here's an injection.
I mean, think
I'd
about
rather be
those
taken
people
off
on
energy than injected.
ventilators.